Hello, welcome to this special Noir event, Writing Lee Child and Ted Lewis. My name is Nick Quantrill. I'm one of the team behind the festival at Noir, which returns March 2021. Tonight, though, we're going to examine and explore writing biographies, namely those relating to Lee Child and Ted Lewis, two very different crime writers, but ones I suspect we might find out more in common than we maybe think. Lee Child is the author of the much-loved Jack Reacher thriller series that are global bestsellers, with the latest being The Sentinel, which was published this week. Ted Lewis was the author of Jack's Return Home, which was filmed as the iconic Get Carter, and is described as probably the most important crime writer you don't know about. The Reacher guy, which I have a copy of here, if that comes out on the screen the correct way, explores the life of Lee Child and is written by Dr. Heather Martin. Heather is a scholar and an author whose work and research has taken her to many places around the globe, but most importantly, Hull University. Getting Carter, which I also have a copy of here, explores the life of Ted Lewis and is written by Hull Noir's Nick Triplow. Nick is also a writer of fiction, including Frank's Wild Years, and has written numerous books about local heritage around the Humber region. So yeah, two excellent biographies, two very important crime writers. So I mean, let's start with you, Heather. When you kind of came up with this sort of idea of writing the Lee Child biography, what did you think you knew about Lee before you started the process?
Well, I knew a lot about Jack Reacher because I'd read all the books. And I think for a long while, I was kind of Lee's ideal reader because Reacher was enough. I didn't really give the author a second thought. Lee Child, that name was just the guarantee of a good read. Then, of course, eventually I did get to know quite a bit about Lee Child too. But one of the most interesting things was that he himself was a fictional construction. And one of the first things he told me about himself was that a lot of the information about him in the public domain was wrong. But that he rarely bothered to correct it because, first of all, this is classically, it wasn't his responsibility to do other people's research for them. And secondly, he kind of liked it that way. So for him to agree to collaborate on the biography, which after all entails, a search after the truth, was quite a major step. And, like he said in one of our joint interviews, we did conspire to make it as true as possible. But of course, the person I knew almost nothing about at that point when I started out, I mean, almost to the point that I barely thought of his existence, was Jim Grant, let alone James Grant as a boy. And it was fascinating to me when I started to think about it, how few people had asked Lee about that. They were just content with the kind of increasingly mythified origin story of him being sacked from Granada Television. But I can give you one very specific example of a thing I thought I knew. I think for a long time, like most other people, I basically believed that Lee Child wrote Killing Floor after he lost his job at Granada Television. But what I discovered, he never told me this. I mean, what I discovered from research in the archive was that he wrote the whole of the sort of 600,000 word first draft while holding down that full-time job at Granada, fighting the big union fight with management and facing, imminent redundancy. So that was probably one of the biggest things and that sort of blew my mind.
Yeah. How about you, Nick, with Ted Lewis? Because I mean, I guess it's a very different scenario, isn't it? Because obviously Ted Lewis died in the early 1980s, didn't he? So it becomes a very different type of story, I suppose, for you.
Yeah, I mean, I knew the film, as do most people. I've read the novel, actually. I did when I did my degree, I did a module on British writing from the 1950s and 1970s, and I managed to crowbar in a crime novel in there, and I chose that one and I used that one, and I knew it quite well. I moved up here to Barton in 2001, and what I knew was that he was overlooked in his hometown to the extent that, he certainly wasn't well regarded, and he had a bit of a reputation, and that when I started asking people, the first thing that happened was that I was warned off writing about him or researching him. So what I knew was there was a story there that people didn't want told, which was a bit of a red rag, to be honest. It's that, well, I'm going after that then, and it's, that's what you do. But I didn't know a huge amount, and there was a lot, and I think similar to Heather's experience with Lee, a lot that was written about him was wrong. And a lot was based on a whole load of misconceptions and ideas that people had imposed on him. The more I dug into it, the more I realized actually there wasn't really grounds for that at all. And that was the interesting part about it, the kind of myth busting aspect of it. Was that, you know, those were the little nuggets of information where you think, oh, actually that assumption is wrong, and that I can kind of set that right and then verify that. That was quite a buzz really in the first instance.
Let's dig into then actually the writing of the biographies and the research for them, because we've got two very different scenarios, haven't we? Where Heather, you're dealing with a living subject, and Nick, obviously Ted has sadly died 40 years before you started writing the book effectively. So how did you go about researching it? Because obviously you had access to the subject, didn't you? And an archive as well to work from.
I very much started with the living subject. I mean, many hours of conversation with Lee and then reading everything that I could about him. But I did then go on to visit the locations. But I'd say that despite Lee's strong connection with Birmingham, the sense of place, which does shape his worldview in abstract terms, has nothing like the importance that it does in Lewis's writing, which I kind of regret, because Reacher, having no fixed abode, gave Lee all kinds of creative license. But my favourite novels of the series are probably those in which that sense of place is most powerful. After the conversation and the locations, I basically started hunting down people, which I did quite a lot of independently, mainly through interest in alumni groups, before I finally persuaded Lee to put me in touch with his first ever editor, David Heifel at G.P. Putnam Sons in New York, and his two best friends from Granada and King Edwards. And I think from those three contacts, the networks really started opening up. Actually, I came to the archive, which is a fundamental difference between us, I know. I came to the archive last for purely circumstantial reasons, and it's kind of the opposite way around to what people might think is the correct way to approach things if an archive exists. But Lee had this habit of tossing bits of paper into boxes, and they'd been accumulating in his Sussex farmhouse. But of course, he didn't think of those boxes as an archive. That was far too grandiose a concept for him. And it was really just me and then the people at the University of East Anglia who kept using that word, you know, can I have access to the archive? And by the time he kind of accepted that idea and agreed to donate all those boxes, I think there were 40 of them, to the British Archive for Contemporary Writing, I just started my research here in New York. So it was kind of, I had to wait. And so I came to the archive late, but for me, that was basically probably a good thing, which, you know, we'll talk a bit more about later, maybe.
How about for you, Nick? Because obviously, like you say, you came to Ted's World in Barton and was immediately warned off from digging sort of too deeply into it. So I guess you clearly no archive for you to access. But so how did you go about constructing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of credit at the beginning. When we started out looking at Ted's life, I was working and doing some stuff with Laurie Harvey. And I met Loz in Barton in about 2007, and he's a journalist, and he basically went after a load of leads, which got us started. But in terms of how that I took that, it was like almost creating a collage of as much information as I could get, and then pulling a narrative together around it. And for a long time, I mean, you know, this was a kind of 10-year project, and I should say for the first half of it, Ted was an absence, and it was about creating a world around him and then getting close to people who knew him and knew him well. But the other thing that I found quite quickly was that he compartmentalized his life to that extent that people who knew him at college had a very, very different perspective on him to those people that knew him at school, or those members of his family, people who knew him well later on in life. And particularly when he came back to Barton towards the end of his life, again, a completely different set of people with a completely different set of perspectives on him. So it was really about finding everything I possibly could and then pulling it together and then deciding, okay, well, this is the story. This this is how this balances out. And that was really the only way I could do it. And there's a lot of reasons why it took a long time, and that's certainly one of them.
Can I just say that concept of compartmentalization is one that Lee himself used in talking about his life, especially as he was growing up. So for him, he was inhabiting completely different spheres at school, and I mean, perhaps we all do at school and at home, and then at Granada, and being different people. So I had a similar experience in a way.
And I think Ted was one of those people who, I mean, I think he did it for fun. I think he did it for kicks half the time. But I think as he got older, it was really the only way he could cope. Because the two worlds that, the world he came from and the world he went to were so diametrically opposed that it kind of required him to be a different person to cope in each of those. He's naturally a shy person. So in order to kind of make himself, that writer from the North who's come to London and, he's writing these incredibly gritty, tough books, he's got to become... Exactly.
Yeah, so as biographers, how do you go about managing that wealth of detail that you've managed to uncover? Because I'm assuming you generate far more than you'd actually need to actually tell the story, but how do you go about sifting that information you've got and trying to work out what you want to keep and what you don't want to keep? Is there a process that you go through?
Well, I mean, I think that's, for me, one reason why it worked out very well for me to come to the archive late, because without some fairly strong principles of omission, I would have been buried beneath the sheer weight of it. And I would say beyond that, I relied on two things really to manage the detail, which obviously, as you say, is potentially infinite. I mean, the basic thing about a biography is you have to accept from the outset that you're leaving almost everything out. I mean, this is a life of 50 years or 65 years or whatever it is you're writing about. And, you've got a limited number of pages. So by definition, you're leaving most of it out. So it is about, selection. So I kind of relied on two things. First was, I think, Lee's own view, which he expressed rather vehemently, as he does, that research is a dish best served cold. That, too much recent research can make a book rather indigestible for the reader. So that was something I tried to be very alert to I suppose, especially at the editing stage. But the other thing, and the main thing, as I was actually writing, was my own sense of story. Because my approach, I think partly I just instinctively wanted to, in some way, I wanted my style to be attuned with my subject, right? So the idea of telling a story was very important to me. And so my approach was to kind of treat each chapter as a self-contained story. I mean, they have their chapter headings like yours, Nick. I wonder if you might have had a bit of a similar thing, actually. And so I wanted each chapter to be a self-contained story that would somehow also, with a bit of luck, light the path ahead. So I sort of selected the details that seemed to me to best illustrate whatever theme or motif I was pursuing at that point, and try then to avoid an accumulation that sort of merely reinforced the point rather than extended or enhanced it. So it was that sort of guiding principle of, people are going to still keep turning the pages, basically.
Yeah.
What about you, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, really quite a similar process. And because I've written non-fiction books before that have been far more straightforward as a kind of combination of context, physical research and oral history, that had kind of worked before, and it didn't with this. It didn't because of his absence. And in a way, it was like kind of bringing all this stuff together. And at the same time, I guess I had that added pressure, which was nobody really knew who Ted Lewis was. And I thought, well, I've got to write a book that people are going to want to read, because it's if they don't, there's no chance of me sort of achieving the thing that I'd set out to do, which was to tell this guy's story to an audience that didn't really know him, and I thought should know him. So I think it was very much about keeping the story front and center, and really, I guess, thinking like a novelist and thinking, okay, how do I tell this story? In fact, nothing goes in there unless it develops the story or expands on the character and develops the character. And really, everything else got chucked out. And that was where I ended up. But it took me a while to kind of get to that point. And as it does, you know, you get huge amounts of stuff. I got, just as an example, I spent a couple of hours with Alan Armstrong, the actor, talking about Get Carter, which was his first major film role. And he was incredible raconteur, brilliant company, and a great person to talk to about that late 60s, what actors were doing, how they were doing stuff, Play for Today, and that kind of social and cultural history. And I ended up using like a fraction of it, and it's there, and you just think, I really want to talk about this, but you can't, because it doesn't actually add to what you're there to do.
So I know that feeling.
And it's real. In the end, you kind of learn that discipline, but my God, it's hard to kind of get to that point.
Very hard.
Yeah, I think to kind of follow up on that question is, you're talking about constructing a narrative, aren't you, effectively through the biography that you're talking about. So where's the balance between fact and interpretation for you as the biographer? Is that kind of your decision to make effectively?
Well, I mean, I think that kind of connects to big issues like the elusiveness of truth and the unreliability of memory.
Yeah, I think you call it nature of memory, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. And it struck me, and that's true even if the people are still living. I mean, let's face it. So it struck me that I was, as I was working, that really, and I think Nick has already said this in a way, that the differences between fiction and non-fiction can be greatly exaggerated, and they tend to be more differences of degree than of kind. I mean, obviously, any kind of selection or ordering or presentation of information is essentially a form of storytelling. And where the facts are difficult to verify or memories conflict, then I suppose you're essentially trying to convey the spirit of the truth as best you can, which I think novelists who are also, broadly speaking, social realists, as is the case with the less cozy forms of crime fiction, also aspire to. So I think there's a real, meeting in the middle there. And for me, where memories conflicted and where I valued the different voices in that conversation, in the end, I just embraced that sort of polyphonic approach. I just thought, let them all have a say and hope that, the reader will sense the truth somewhere, at the intersection. And once I accepted that, I found it kind of liberating, because it seemed to me that all lives, whether or not they're the subject of biography, are full of loose ends. And for the biographer to pretend otherwise is kind of delusional. And I think it's kind of ironic that so often the word definitive is associated with the genre biography. Because, like I said before, you're leaving so much out, you're making choices for various complex reasons. It's never going to be definitive, but hopefully it's going to be informative and a good read, and coherent and fair to your subject.
How about for you, Nick? Because I guess you maybe, was there an element of more interpretation for you because the record as such isn't as set in stone, and maybe in a way that was for when there's a lot more written about somebody like Lee Child?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that notion of like the definitive being so elusive that it's not really it's not there. You can reach for it and you can go to grab for it, but it's not there. You're not going to be definitive, but what you can be, and I made a point. I can distinctly remember sitting down to write the introduction to the book and saying, "Look, I'm not going to try and neaten the ends on Ted's behalf." And I just wanted to make that clear from the outset, which is, this is somebody who was a really complex character, a really complex man who lived a really interesting and difficult life and left an awful lot of loose ends behind him. And it's not my job to sort of tidy those up for kind of narrative convenience. So but in a sense, what I knew was that the people who were going to be reading my book were going to be readers of crime fiction. And I trust them. And I trust them that if I put the facts in front of them, they'll draw their conclusions and they'll use their own kind of critical analysis to reach a point where, okay, we know this, or this we don't know, but that's okay, we can move on. So it's really about, to a certain extent, not wanting to break that contract that you have with a reader, which says, you know, I'm not going to keep saying, well, you could argue this or you could argue that. I'm going to say, well, this is what I've got. Think what you think on that basis.
Yeah, I actually tried very hard not to make too many judgments.
Yeah.
Where you said about just now about arguing a case or something, I thought I'm reluctant to pronounce judgment on my subject in most cases, but I just put the information out there.
I'll give you an example with Ted, particularly because of his kind of clear, obvious problems with drink. There's a few people who've kind of reviewed the book or spoken to me about it. So, you know, well, why didn't you say what was, you know, what caused the drink problem? It's like, I don't know. How does anybody know? You know, it's one of those things where it could have been a single thing that happened in his adolescence or childhood, but it could have been a multitude of things, various different things. And I'm not gonna sort of cod analyze somebody's psychology or the reason why somebody does what they do. You know, this is their life. This is what they did. You've got to make your own mind up why you think that is.
Yeah, so to build on that point, was there anything that you uncovered during the process that you chose not to include in the biography, or maybe weren't able to use during the writing of the biographies? Did you have kind of essentially have free rein to tell the story as you saw fit?
Do you want to go first, Nick? I mean,
yeah, I mean, there was some stuff that where obviously Ted was writing about the late 60s and early 70s and writing in Soho and was talking about, was hanging out with various people. And I spoke to some people who told me things and then got back to me after and said, look, maybe you shouldn't say that. And there were other things that I found out that I just thought, well, this isn't actually serving the story. So there were various reasons for pulling things out. And clearly with somebody who lived quite a chaotic lifestyle, there were lots of people who had horror stories and had experienced him at his worst. And it's that, well, I don't want a book that's just a series of kind of escapades of what happened when somebody had too much to drink. What's the point? And so I just kept a lot of that stuff, not a lot of it out, but I kept enough of it there that you could understand what was going on, but you didn't need, you know, a huge amount of detail about what somebody did, you know, when they couldn't remember afterwards, those kind of blackout kind of things.
It's a matter of proportion, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
I think there were always going to be boundaries you choose not to cross, and especially probably as regards the living. It was pretty rare, but occasionally Lee would tell me something when we were talking, and then he'd add, you can't write that.
Yeah.
And because it was so rare, I knew he meant it, because he was basically very permissive and very non-interventionist while I was working. And then there were other things that I took a decision on, much like you, Nick, where I found myself basically thinking, how would I feel?
Yeah.
I mean, those are matters of personal sensitivity, but a defining feature of the Lee Child story is industry myth-making. And I could write a whole other book on that, that's for damn sure. Lee didn't exactly censor me on that, you know, in that area at all. And I included a fair bit, but basically it sort of boiled down to a question of how long do you want this book to be? And my kind of emphasis was always, partly because I was dealing with, I think, a living writer, living family, my emphasis was always going to be on a portrait of the artist as a young man. And that worked out very well, because I think it all goes right back to the beginning for him. Anyway, I think that was, you know, what it was all about. And it was also why I was actually very happy to end the biography where I did, which is another big question for me in particular, I think, to end it with Blue Moon, because I wanted to write a book about the man, not the franchise.
Yeah.
You know, not the big business brand that is Jack Reacher Books. You know, all that narrative we're getting just right now about the new chapter. I didn't really, you know, I was happy to have my 24 chapters and all the stuff that came before. So yeah, there is, you're exercising judgment all the time, aren't you? In that sense, aesthetic judgment, and moral, I think, ethical judgment.
Yeah, I think one thing we touched on generally in the conversation is that literary biographies are quite common, but not so much in the field of crime fiction. Do you have any particular thoughts on why maybe we don't see many biographies of crime fiction writers, particularly British ones? Is that something that was kind of on your mind maybe when you actually wanted to write the biographies that you've done?
I think, you know, it's clearly a legacy of the British literary tradition. And I think that's a subject that Nick addresses just so, you know, so eloquently towards the end in particular of Getting Carter. So I really think he's the guy who should answer that question, because I'm pretty sure he's going to have views on it.
Well, it's interesting actually. I did a quick look on the Amazon's top 100 books, biographies of novelists, playwrights, and poets. And in that top 100, there is one biography of a living thriller writer, and it's Heather's.
Oh, groundbreaking.
Groundbreaking. Now, given the popularity of genre fiction in this country and the fact that it outsells everything else hugely, isn't that an interesting point that
Fascinating.
That, you know, you can be a poet who sells, you know, 50 volumes of a book of poetry, of an anthology, and be fated. But if you're somebody whose appeal is to a mass audience and you're writing genre fiction, you've got to be of the stature of somebody like Lee Child, or to be spoken about 50 years later like Ted Lewis with Get Carter, to warrant some kind of review of your work and your life and your experience.
Yeah, I think the thing about me, and perhaps the reason why it happened then, is that perhaps because of my academic background, I didn't really approach Lee as a crime fiction writer. I didn't really approach him as a genre writer at all. I just read his books as I had read many other books. And I was never that concerned about trying to place him in the pantheon. In a way, I think it's far too soon to do that anyway. I mean, you do have greater distance in all senses from your subject. And although, Nick, you mentioned earlier that a lot more has been written about Lee, and in terms of sheer, you know, volume of material, that's no doubt true. I mean, Ted Lewis's work has undergone quite a number of cultural adaptations, hasn't it? Which I think really helps the biographer to place his work in context and perspective, and that hasn't really happened with Lee. You know, it's just been one book after another. I mean, I know that Lee read, as you would expect, Ted Lewis before he became Lee Child, and they're kind of there's an obvious euphony between the names of their two characters. So, you know, no doubt we're talking about the influence of Lewis on Child there, and that's something that you dealing with, you know, a subject a little bit further back in time with a bit more distance, so just that bit better place to assess, I think. But yeah, I basically didn't think I'm going to write a biography of a crime fiction author. I just thought, this is a fascinating guy. He's a phenomenon. This is a story I could tell. I want to do it.
and in a sense, that was where I came from as well. I didn't write with the expectation. I mean, half the time I didn't write with the expectation of it ever being published. But the reality of the fact that, you know, as I started to do that research, you know, there's another stage production of Get Carter, and then another one, and then there's a radio adaptation of Get Carter, of Jack's Return Home, and suddenly you realize this isn't going to go away. This character that he created in 1969, 1970, who was filmed, you know, and released in 1971, he's going to stay with us. He's created something that wasn't there in in British genre fiction before, and he's created that synthesis of British social realism and American noir and kind of gritty crime thriller. And somehow or another, it's found its place in our culture, and it's going to stay there. Yeah. And in a sense, it's like, well, if that's what it takes to have a biography written about you, well, I might as well get on and do it then.
Yeah. There's a connection between the two characters, Jack Reacher and Jack Carter, and it's almost like Jack Carter is father of Jack Reacher in that lineage of crime fiction.
Yeah, I think you could say there's a lot of similarities between them, in the same way that I think there clearly are quite more similarities than people perhaps expect between Lee Child and Ted Lewis.
I think there are. I mean, there was one when I was reading your book, there was one, they both had rheumatic fever as a child.
I know. I was so struck by that, the heart trouble, and at the same age.
Yes.
And it had the same impact. You know,
Exactly.
took them out of school, placed them under the control of their mothers, made them retreat, escape their mothers, into art or reading or whatever it was, into creative pursuits, and imagine, you know, the world of the imagination. I was so struck by that.
Yeah, absolutely incredible parallels between these two writers.
And they both feel then somehow compelled to create these incredibly tough guy heroes, you know, indestructible, indomitable. Well,
I think that's an excellent place to stop, because we're going to run out of time shortly. So I think we have to encourage people to go out and read the book to learn more about these two fascinating crime fiction writers. So as ever, thank you very much, Heather, for joining us. Thank you to Nick as well. Both books, The Reacher Guy and Get Carter, are both in the bookshops available now and online. So thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice to chat.
Bye. Thank you.